when a grass breeder starts on a variety, when that variety actually ends up in a bag that a farmer can sow in his field, that's generally a 12 to 16 year process. I think we all need to work together closely on this to try speed up the process rather than slow down the process, because if we start breeding a variety here today in 2024, reality is it could be 2040 before that variety is actually sown out in the field down the road from us here in Tipperary. So it isn't an overnight process, it is a slow process.
Hello, I'm Stuart Childs and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge Teagasc Dairy Podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With the late spring this year, the demand for grass seed has been understandably low to date, but with schemes promoting multi-species swards and red clover, along with regular planned reseeding activities likely to pick up over the next few weeks. Today I'm joined by Dr. Mary McEvoy, Technical Director with Germinal, not to talk about reseeding itself, but to give us an overview of the direction of travel within the seed industry. I started by asking Mary to comment on the PPI and how it has changed the grass seed industry.
Yeah, so I suppose, Stuart, it's interesting in terms of how the Pasture Profit Index definitely has changed how farmers look at varieties, because before we just had the recommended list, which was quantifying difference in varieties in terms of percentage differences, be it grams per kilogram or increase or decrease in tonnage, and a lot of it was given and looks to be quite small differences. And I suppose when the Pasture Profit Index came out, and what was interesting about that is it quantified it in euro terms, so you could see the real differences that one variety over another had the potential to deliver out on farm in that economic term. And it was easier, I think, for a lot of people to understand it as well. Interestingly, I suppose, from a breeding perspective and from a grass production perspective or a grass seed perspective, it probably hasn't changed as much insofar as we were always looking at those varieties which are going to deliver more in terms of quality, in terms of seasonality of yield. So there was a big push to identify varieties which could deliver more in the spring yield, and I suppose the Pasture Profit Index allows us to see what that means in euro terms. But there was very few varieties that were there 10 years ago that were the most prominent or most in demand varieties in Ireland. They didn't just drop off the top all of a sudden when the PPI came out. It kind of showed that the progress was going in the right direction, but I think it definitely gave an easier means to understand how variety performed and how affected farms in euro terms. And obviously when we talk about money, it's a common terminology to everyone, I suppose.
And I suppose you said there that it obviously didn't influence hugely the type of seed maybe that you had in the programs coming through, because it kind of actually reinforced your breeding programs more than anything else. But does it create a bit of an issue for you from the point of view of, it's a bit like the EBI with the bulls, that people are looking for the best of the varieties, and yet there are some very good varieties that you have that, okay, they're not maybe at 240 or 250 euro for PPI, but that they still can do quite a good job on farm?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's probably a fair comment. It probably does drive demand on particular varieties, and I think sometimes people get caught up on looking at the overall, Pasture Profit Index or PPI value of an individual variety, and look at maybe, we'd have a lot of requests from people maybe looking at the top two varieties and wanting to put those into a mixture and, thinking that's going to be the most suitable mix for their farm. But I think with grasses, we also still need to consider, the type of ground the seed is going to be sown into and the management that it's also going to be under. If, there's no point in putting out something with huge spring growth, maybe if it's going into a wet field and we can't get into that until the end of April or something like that. So I suppose there are practicalities that we need to keep in consideration when it comes to the blending grass varieties and blending mixtures together. And I mean, some of the key things that we'd be looking at would be the heading date, to make sure that, we have a relatively tight heading date, because that simplifies it from a management perspective. We don't really want to see a situation where we're putting in, varieties, something heading out in, maybe the 21st of May, and then something else not heading out into the 14th of June, where you've, nearly 3 weeks in terms of a range and heading date, because that makes it challenging from a management perspective, because in order to keep the quality into that mixture. So I suppose when we're formulating grass mixes, we're looking at heading dates. We're also trying to get the right balance in terms of diploids and tetraploids. And we have seen a shift in recent years towards more tetraploids going into mixtures because, to be fair, they are more palatable. We see better animal intake with them. And, the research has proven now as well that we see better animal performance with tetraploids. But, some farmers and some farms, a proportion of diploid is still beneficial, especially where, you have springs like the spring we're just after coming through, where ground conditions are really wet. And if you have very open tetraploids, you're much more likely to poach them. And, not everybody, to be fair, is measuring grass. Not everybody is, identifying which field has the highest yield on it and which, is due to be grazed next. Some people are still following a set rotation plan, and maybe that isn't the best way to manage our grass. But when we're formulating mixtures, I suppose you're trying to make sure what's going into the bag is going to work for as many people as possible.
Okay, and I suppose to add on then to the Pasture Profit Index development 10 years ago, obviously Tomas did the grazing utilisation piece. So what has that brought in terms of more information, or maybe more challenges again even for you in terms of identifying seeds that you're going to bring forward, or selling what you do have then maybe when sometimes the trials after all, like people probably don't realise there's huge amount of work goes on in the background of bringing the seeds to the point where maybe Tomas is testing them here, like, and I mean it's like backing the wrong horse maybe in some cases. It's a bit of a crystal ball gazing type scenario for you to try to pick out what you're going to use, like.
Yeah, like I suppose no different to the grass utilisation trait. I mean, DUS is another hurdle we have to jump through when we're with varieties before they go to market, which is basically its distinctiveness, uniformity and stability. And before a variety can actually be marketed, it has to pass that. And that's essentially to make sure, Stuart, that I haven't taken a variety, for example, that you've bred and called it something different and put it into the bag. So it's a kind of a plant, it's there to protect plant breeders' rights. And, you would have some varieties that are coming through, recommended list trials and looking really promising. And, they might fail the DUS because they're too similar to another variety. Okay. And in that test, they can't differentiate them. And, I mean, I suppose until it's true DUS, we would rarely produce or go to the commercialization stage of a seed for that reason, because it's too risky to produce 10 tonnes of something that fails because it's just a little bit too similar to another variety and then you can't sell it. In terms of, I suppose, the work that Tomas has done, like obviously, utilisation is hugely important, and anything we sow out on farm, we want to make sure that animals are going to graze it, and I suppose that's useful from our perspective, but it's also useful, obviously, hugely useful from the farmer's perspective. So yeah, look, I mean, the issue or the problem we have, I suppose, at the moment is it's very, very difficult, and we haven't, or there hasn't been a trait identified that, breeders can breed for that will tell you if this variety is going to be utilised better by the animal compared to another variety. So, it's animal grazing trials that's given us that information at the moment. And obviously that slows down the whole process of getting a variety maybe from the ready to market to actual market, because until, you want to know how a variety is going to perform in terms of that utilisation trait before it's actually brought to that commercialisation phase, because it is having an impact in terms of the demand for particular varieties as well. And I suppose it is important, to understand what that utilisation trait, means from a farmer's perspective. And at the moment, it's quantified in stars, where, you have a range of 1 to 5 stars for each variety, whereas 1 is deemed not very palatable or not utilised well by the animal, and 5 stars is deemed to be much more utilised. But I suppose the difference in terms of economic value, if that was quantified in actual euro terms, wouldn't look probably as big, because you could have a 50-cent difference between a 2-star and a 3-star. And, out on farm, farmers, they see a star and they think that star is having a big effect. But in reality, the difference in euro terms might actually only be 50 cent per hectare per year. So, I suppose there is a little bit of a need, I suppose, to quantify that and maybe bring it all into euro values. And I think that would probably simplify the whole understanding process from farmers, because you could see then how a variety is doing in spring growth, summer growth, autumn growth, quality, its persistency, and then its utilisation. And you can kind of compare across all traits. But yeah, look, I mean, at the moment, I suppose, again, where we stand at the moment, we have a star rating for that utilisation trait. And, farmers, I think, are beginning to look at it. And you have a certain cohort of farmers also obviously looking at the Pasture Profit Index. And that has, driven probably demand for certain varieties, as you say, over the last number of years. But I suppose there's also a level of trust put into the co-ops and merchants when they're formulating mixtures, that they're trying to bring the best mixes that they can, or best varieties they can, in a bag to their customers. So, all these traits, I suppose, are being taken into consideration before a mixture is finalised and put into a bag,
Yeah, okay. And is there a kind of a hope then? We'll say, like you said there, you can't actually predict in terms of the utilization rate currently. Is there a hope that there's some sort of a marker that you can use that might be able to indicate that, or is there anything on the horizon in that sense?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I suppose, Teagasc are continuing to do some work on this. And I suppose as we get more information, yeah, obviously, if we can identify a marker that we could look at in early in our breeding program, and obviously, make sure the varieties you're bringing are going to deliver from a utilization as well as delivering from a seasonality of yield, persistency, and quality perspective, that would be beneficial. Because, the breeding process, so when a grass breeder starts on a variety, to when that variety actually ends up, in a bag that a farmer can sow in his field, that's generally a 12 to 16 year process. And I suppose, if, there's another trait to put in there that we can't quantify in breeding, or we can't have a marker, for example, for our breeders to use, then that could actually slow down some of those new varieties getting to that stage. Because again, if it's not going to be utilised or palatable to the animal, there's no point in bringing it through the commercialisation phase in the first place. So yeah, look, I think we all need to work together closely on this to try speed up the process rather than slow down the process. Because, if we start breeding a variety here today in 2024, reality is it could be 2040 before that variety is actually sown out in the field down the road from us here in Tipperary. So, it isn't an overnight process. It is a slow process.
Yeah, it's phenomenal actually that it's as long as that, because like we're used to talking about generation interval in terms of animals, but we never probably give that consideration to grass seed. Like, so just moving on then, Mary. I suppose I said I wasn't going to talk to you too long about the PPI. What I really want to pick your brain about is the kind of the future of forage seeds as a whole, because like if we went back 10 years ago, obviously PPI and so forth coming on the horizon, big changes in terms of grass seed. We've a sea change effectively in terms of the way things are being approached on farms now again, with clover after coming back in vogue after a 20-year hiatus, I suppose, effectively. And also now we have some talk of multi-species, and we'll say red clover, which was probably something that we wouldn't have come across when we were in college, not too distant times apart from one another. Wasn't really on the agenda when we were in college, so it's very much on the agenda now. So what way do you in Germinal see the whole thing going in terms of the clover, the multi-species? Are there other varieties of grasses that we need to be looking at? Maybe like the way the climate appears to be changing, it's very concerning, I suppose. Like we've had an unrelenting period of wet weather effectively since, like we were saying at the start there, since last July, and down on top of us again in the last couple of days. So it's like, is that going to influence the direction that people are going, or the type of lays that people are going to sow? I suppose that's the best term to use to cover all.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think if we skip 2024 and go back to 2023, and 5 years prior to that, we had a drought every year for 5 years. We even had a drought, what we would call a drought, in May of last year. So yeah, we're definitely seeing more extremes in the climate. And they are getting more difficult, I suppose, because if you have drought one year and you have a washout like what we're dealing with at the moment, realistically, I suppose, and the reality is there's very few varieties that can tolerate both extremes, or very few species, I should say, that can tolerate both extremes. So as we get more experience and suffer more with climate change, I think it is going to become more of a challenge. And you might have certain fields on your farm that are your drier fields, and you'll put certain species into them, and in the heavier fields, or those that are a little bit more prone to be on the wetter side, you'll be possibly putting different species into them. I think grass and white clover, so perennial ryegrass and white clover, are going to be the mainstay and underpin our mixes for the foreseeable future. White clover obviously has a huge amount to offer in terms of improving animal performance, reducing the requirement for fertilizer nitrogen. It improves soil health as well. And if we can grow as much grass with less nitrogen input, then white clover is going to deliver a lot. But there is management concerns and issues there as well with that we need to there's still more space or more need, I suppose, to adapt to white clover and increase the white clover content on our farms. We are seeing more, definitely, I'd noticed that even in the last, maybe 4 or 5 years, more calls from farmers looking for a species which will be more drought tolerant, or, suit, a field that floods a little bit more. And we are, farmers are looking for alternatives, I suppose, because perennial ryegrass wouldn't be particularly drought tolerant. especially if we talk about, a real drought, which is probably where you have very low soil moisture levels for a prolonged period of time. And it doesn't like being underwater either, whereas there are alternative varieties or alternative species, I should say, which are more tolerant of those, but then you're compromising maybe in terms of seasonality of growth or quality of those across the mid-season period. So there is a lot of work in terms of breeding programs going into some alternatives. So looking at crosses between, Festilolium crosses between fescues and perennial ryegrass or Lolium perennes or Italian ryegrasses, to kind of give additional spring growth, maybe be a bit more tolerant to droughts, and also that deeper rooting structure should also be more tolerant to deluges of rain, insofar as if you have more roots, water can get through the ground and drain away quicker than a more shallow root system. So that would be one thing. There's work going on in breeding cocksfoots now as well, which you're probably not even aware of that. It's something we wouldn't have spoken about much in the past, Stuart. And I mean, cocksfoot can be very unpalatable if it gets and gets very tufty, and again it's just trying to improve the quality of cocksfoots. And again, I suppose, Stuart, these aren't going to be available in the next 2 or 3 years, but they are areas that, breeders are working on, because we do foresee that in, 15, 20 years time, we might have a different profile in terms of what we demand from our grasses than what we're looking at today. But I do think, the perennial ryegrass, which can deliver good seasonality of growth, high quality across the main grazing season, and it is persistent, that probably will underpin a lot of the mixtures, as I say, for the foreseeable. You mentioned multi-species there. Like, there's been strong interest in multi-species for the last 2 or 3 years. Some of that is obviously due to the work that's happened in Teagasc Johnstown Castle, and also in University College Dublin, or the UCD Lions Farm, where they've got very good results from grazing multi-species. But I think we also need to look at those results, and often, it's a comparison of multi-species versus perennial ryegrass. And there are definite differences there and definite benefits to the multi-species over that. But if you look at the multi-species compared to the perennial ryegrass with white clover, those differences are often not as clear cut, and again, the white clover is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in our multi-species swards. And I suppose the herbs, the plantains and the chicories and the likes, yes, they're doing a lot below the ground that we are only probably beginning to quantify, or the research is only beginning to quantify. But there are benefits, in my mind, certainly to below ground soil health from having, the likes of your chicory there, which is a deep root, nearly like a root like a dock, which is a much deeper root, and it opens up the soil. And, where we see multi-species swards, the soil is more friable, it's a healthier looking soil. You get better water movement through the soil in the winter, and they're also less prone to burning up in the summer. They will still burn up, if you hit a drought, but, they are a little bit more tolerant than, say, a straight perennial ryegrass. And we see a lot more earthworms in soils where there's multi-species compared to perennial ryegrass. So, there are benefits, in my mind, to that extent with the multi-species. I suppose if the herbs die out after 2 or 3 years and you're left with a grass white clover sward, it's probably not the end of the world. But and they do work, to be fair, Stuart, in certain systems more so than others. The dry stock, we do see them working really well. Seems to be a little bit harder to marry them with the dairy system. They just don't work quite as well. And I suppose that's often the issue is we might only have maybe, 1 or 2 or 3 paddocks or fields down with multi-species, and then they're on grass for the vast majority of the time. So, the multi-species, it's a slightly longer rotation is what we advise, 25 to 30 days. So, it's more difficult, I suppose, from a management perspective, where you've, only a handful of fields or even one field with multi-species and the rest is perennial ryegrass, white clover. But there's breeding work, I suppose, going on in terms of, your chicories, your plantains. There's been very little work done on plantain historically, so there's breeding work going on at that now, and we expect to make big progress over a very short period of time with plantains, because there has been so little breeding done on that historically. And I suppose, look, white clover and the perennial ryegrass is where most of our investment in terms of our R&D is going, but obviously we are looking at alternative species there as well.
So basically, you'd be advocating for people that are trying to do the right thing, I suppose, to look at the grass clover thing, and in particular, and then maybe for the odd person that's very keenly interested in it, multi-species may play a role for them, but en masse, you don't see that maybe slotting into the dairy system as much as people might like to think, because a lot of talk about it, Mary, I suppose, and obviously some of the department schemes supporting it, and maybe almost enticing people to go for it, and maybe it's just not the right thing for them. Am I picking you up correctly in that?
Look, they do have a role, but I don't think they're suited to everybody. And I do think, if we look at any of the research that's happened, the clover, as I say, is doing an awful lot of the heavy lifting in our multi-species swards. So, I think if we get, good white clover establishment in our grazing swards, where you're up at that target of 20 to 25% clover on average across the year, I think that's going to deliver a lot to a lot of people.
Okay, so just on the clover then, I suppose, like you said, there's 12 to 16 years to bring a variety of grass through the market. I presume it's no different for the clover. And are we a little bit in the back foot in terms of maybe clover breeding? And the other question then, if you'll take all of them at the same time, is breeding to deal with the management challenges maybe that you mentioned there a while ago. Like, so obviously the big concern is the B word, as they say, bloat. And that really bothers people, like, and understandably so. Like, there's nothing more discomforting than to be unnerved that when you've left the cows into that lovely paddock, that you've done everything right to get it to that it's actually going to kill some of your cows potentially. And look, that's, I suppose, people are aware of it, but it's very little control over the conditions. Maybe, like, it's just another layer of management. You mentioned it already, that there's just that little bit extra. So is there scope in terms of the breeding program that we can eliminate that concern for people over the next number of years, or eliminate is probably a big ask, that maybe the varieties might be less prone to trigger bloat in cases. Now, obviously, there's a lot that people can do from a management point of view of the cows themselves. Like, I know a couple of the monitor farms tend to maybe let the cows into their clover swards before they've finished grazing out the last paddock, and then let them back to graze, so that they've had a start of acclimatization period and so forth. And people just need to be aware of it. But, like, just from a breeding point of view, is there scope to breed to avoid those kind of management issues? And I suppose the other management issue is the persistence of them both. I suppose their resilience to poaching, as you said. If we're going to continue to get weather like this, like, they'll need to be persistent, like.
So, like, white clover, I suppose, because of its stoloniferous growth habit, it is relatively persistent insofar as, the stolons could be up to a metre in width from, and that's the same plant. So, I suppose it has the ability to be persistent. It tends not to get wiped out where we would poach, unless we absolutely do an awful lot of damage, Stuart. And if we do a lot of damage, we shouldn't be doing a lot of damage,
Yeah.
I suppose.
That's an infrastructure issue rather than
Yeah. 100% agree with you. Bloat is obviously a huge concern, and nobody wants that stress of, walking off the farm in the evening, and even the hassle of having to go back out and check cows. Like, there's enough going on. People are busy enough without having to do that. But the reality is that, we do need to have measures in place, and especially in those fields where we have a high content of clover, and be that giving them, like, a bit of silage in the yard when they're in for milking. What you said, I think, is working really well for farmers, moving them into the high clover field before they finished out the previous field, and then letting it back. And I think it's about taking the appetite off the cow. If she's going in hungry, she's really at risk. And if we can avoid that, the cow going in and absolute gorging onto white clover, I think we do eliminate some of the risk. I don't think we're going to be able to do much in terms of breeding to reduce or eliminate I'll say, the risk of bloat. Not in the clover per se, but we are looking at alternative species and other species, such as the likes of bird's foot trefoil, which has high tannin content. And we do know that where there's tannins, we reduce the risk of bloat with that. And maybe, our mixes down the road will be slightly different. It might be, grass, white clover, and something else to try to reduce that risk. But, you just need to make sure if that's where we do end up, that we get good establishment of the extra species in there, if that species is there to reduce the risk of bloat to the animal. If it is something like bird's foot trefoil, which we haven't had much success in terms of the persistency of bird's foot trefoil to date, we do now have some bird's foot trefoil in our breeding program, which are shown very good persistency under sheep grazing. They've been, selected, taken from selections in South America, and they are tolerating grazing very, very well. But again, we're a number of years away from having a commercially available variety. But potentially there are, breeders, white clover breeders are tuned into the risk that animals are exposed with bloat, and we are looking at alternative species to eliminate or reduce that risk of bloat to animals. But again, for the next couple of years, we're going to be having to increase the level of management we apply and do, and it is more work for guys. I'm fully aware of that. But I suppose, if we are trying to reduce, and, there is strong pressure to reduce the nitrogen we're using out on farm, if we are going in that direction, white clover is the most obvious one to suit the system that we have.
And I suppose, Mary, it's important to point out it's the transition phase is probably the biggest challenge, really. Like if we have full farms of clover now, we'll call a full farm of clover probably 75% clover, because we're probably always going to have that little bit of kind of rejuvenation required or whatever. Like that's an awful lot easier system to manage than maybe where the systems that we have currently, where we might have anywhere from 5 to 25 to, in some cases, I suppose there are farms that are up on 60% clover at this stage. Like their life is a lot easier nearly now than the person that's at the 5 or 10% clover, because they have to be conscious of when they do go into that field that there is a change of diet occurring, really. Like,
yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's very fair to say. And another thing I suppose we would have noticed over the last, 12 or 18 months or so is farmers looking for very high levels of clover in their mixes.
yes,
We'd have 3/4 of a kilo or 0.75 of a kilo of white clover in our standard 12-acre pack, which would have increased from 0.6 of a kilo last year. We are on that movement, I suppose, to increase. I would like more clover in our mixes, but we also need to be conscious that not every farmer has much clover as it stands, and I don't think we should be going from a situation where we have had 0.6 of a kilo of clover going into a mixture for the last number of years, and in some cases that clover actually being just sprayed out or not managed and dying away of its own accord, I suppose, to 2.5, 3, 4 kilos of clover in a mix. I think that's really risky. If you don't have much clover on the farm, I think you need to start a process and make sensible jumps, I suppose, into clover content in your mixtures, rather than go from zero to that level of 2 or 4 kilos, as I say, which we are seeing a little bit of at the moment as well.
Okay, and then just we'll stick with the white for a minute now, but in terms of the potential for the breeding program for white clover, in terms of maybe tonnage and so forth, is there scope there to, or maybe even I suppose the key thing is probably the amount of nitrate that it can fix. Is that something that you can track?
Yeah, it is, and Germinal in the UK recently got funding from DEFRA, which is the UK government, essentially to lead a project where they're now looking. It's a £4.7 million project in total, and it started this year. But we're looking at rhizobia bacteria, better matching rhizobia bacteria, which to soil and to clover varieties as well, to basically increase the potential of nitrogen fixation. So the breeders believe they can achieve up to 300 kilos of nitrogen fixed by white clover plants with the right rhizobia bacteria on them. So, that will be a huge step change. At the moment, we'd be talking about 100 to 150 kilos of nitrogen being fixed by white clover. So that, that's a really exciting, I suppose, development. And, the fact there's money behind that from DEFRA in the UK as well. Hopefully over the next 5 years, we'll see huge progress in that front. A lot of work going on in other areas of white clover. Maybe, we're seeing now more and more out on farm. Phosphorus is becoming more limiting for a lot of dairy farmers in particular.
It's across all systems, really.
Across all systems, yeah. No, that's a fair comment. Yeah, absolutely. But we're looking at white clovers now that are more tolerant of low phosphorus scenarios. So that will grow well, because at the moment, we do really encourage white clover to be sown into where you have a soil pH of 6.5 or above and P&K index at 3. And often we see the farmers just don't have an allowance for P going out onto their ground, or not much of an allowance, we'll say, at least. So we are making big progress in terms of breeding clovers that are more prolific at lower phosphorus levels, and can perform as well as a standard white clover at in index 3 in an index 1 soil. So yeah, look, we are making progress in that front. But I think the nitrogen fixation and that New Lake project that I mentioned, I think that we'll get big progress in a short period of time there. There's 10 partners involved, so there's a lot of work going to happen in that front over the very short-term future.
Okay, so then just moving on to the red clover then, because as you were saying when we were having a chat before we started, that's the area that you see kind of the big win, maybe for the dairy farmers in particular. Like, as you said, you have your concerns in relation to the multi-species and how they slot into the dairy system. The red clover is a big opportunity to reduce nitrogen on the farm, which is obviously the pressure that farms are coming under, is to reduce that level of chemical fertiliser that's been used on the farm. And if we do that, Brendan Horne's been very clear on it, if we do that and we don't replace it with some form of nitrogen, which is why we're talking about the white clover there a second ago, we're going to see a reduction in pasture production on the farm, which means we reduce our stock carrying capacity, and that may trigger a person having to actually cut back numbers if they're not able to feed them on the basis of the farm that they have. So the red clover obviously in the short term probably gives the opportunity to people to transition to the white clover, in that it can save that nitrogen off the silage ground that can potentially continue to be used on the grazing ground in the short term while we transfer over. So tell me a little bit more from your experience of selling the seeds and so forth, and the experience that the people that you're selling it to in relation to the red clover. What's that like?
So, I mean, red clover, I suppose, has a lot to offer in terms of if we can grow a 14 or 15 ton crop with virtually no nitrogen, artificial nitrogen going in, there's a huge saving to be made from a farmer's perspective, both, I suppose, economically, Stuart, but also in terms of that reduced nitrogen, and maybe gives a little bit more of an allowance on other parts of the farm. So look, we have seen very strong interest in terms of the red clover over the last 2 or 3 years, I suppose, predominantly maybe since fertilizer prices skyrocketed there in 2022, and also I suppose the department obviously have the grant there for their supporting farmers with the establishment of both your red clover silage swords or also your multi-species swords, which we talked about already. So this year that scheme, for farmers who applied for that the red clover silage scheme, they had to apply by the 15th of May of this year, and they have up until the 15th of July to actually sow the crop. So we are seeing quite strong demand from farmers for red clover silage swords again this year. I do believe that even if the scheme wasn't there, I do believe that a lot of dairy farmers have seen the benefit of red clover in their systems, even though it isn't, I suppose, easy to manage, and especially when we're looking out the window at the rain. Might be raining here today, but we've had plenty of rain over the last little while, and since last July really, it's been a challenge out on farm in terms of red clover. It does probably close on a 48-hour wilt. It is important to dry up the crop. It's a low dry matter crop, and getting a good wilt is really, really important. Otherwise you'll have very saggy or soggy bales. So last year was a challenge, and I suppose there is an element of you have to take your opportunities when they come, and if 2 dry days came, to try to get the crop mowed and into a bale and out of the field within that 48 hours or whatever the case may be. So look, I think they have a lot to offer. It's homegrown protein, high quality homegrown protein, as I say, has the potential to grow 14, 15 tonne, even in excess of that. And we've seen higher levels grown on some farms. But, I think realistically, a 14 or 15 tonne crop is still a decent crop to get with no artificial nitrogen. They are hungry, I suppose, or it is important to maintain your P and K status in your fields. If you have 14 tonnes of coming out, that's an awful lot of K in particular being removed out of the field. And, we need to focus on that as well, because my concern is, and you would have plenty of experience of this, is in our silage blocks, we tend to run them down dramatically in terms of the K and bring them to the floor really, because we're just literally not feeding them enough K. Like for a 14 tonne crop of red clover, you're probably talking about 375 kilos of K needed per hectare. So it is quite substantial, and we need to remember to make sure that we are adequately feeding the crop, rather than just taking, because if we don't replace that P and K in particular, the persistency of the crop will be shortened, and if we shorten, if we're not getting the longevity out of it, obviously that's going to compromise the value or the economic return to the farm as well. So it is something that we need to keep in mind and bear in mind with our red clover silage swords. And look, I mean, definitely it's simpler in drier years. The red clover probably does better in drier, when ground is a little bit drier. Doesn't like being travelled in, when conditions are wet or when ground is a little bit on the soft side. And we have all, I think, at this stage seen, red clover travelled, in less than ideal conditions, but there was no alternative, I suppose, towards the end of last year. And, it has reduced the red clover content in certain fields, and you especially see that in the tram lines where tractors have driven. So it does require a little bit extra care, I suppose, and attention to get the most from it. But I think it does have a lot to deliver to our farming system into the future.
Does that mean that there's going to be fairly significant changes in the way people do things though too, Mary? And I'm coming at from that, the angle I'm coming at there maybe is even like you look up at the north and you see that they handle a lot of slurry very differently to the way, now they have a lot more slurry maybe, but they handle slurry differently, the likes of the nurse tanks, and using pipe systems maybe to apply slurry on that kind of ground rather than using tankers that are obviously going to put that bit more weight. Are things like that things that people are going to have to consider to try to mind it?
Yeah, look, I suppose, I mean, it's hard to know. I don't think if we were sitting here this time last year, Stuart, I don't think we would ever have imagined we would have got the weather we're after getting over the last, sure, 11, we're nearly going for 11 months of it now, which was hard to believe. And I mean, even when we were sitting in February and it was downpours of rain outside, we were like, should we take it now? Sure, March will be back. And it just hasn't. Do you know, so I mean, I suppose you need to respond to you know, a number of years as an average rather than take drastic steps just to 1 year. And I mean, we haven't seen a year like a 12-month period like this for a long time. Like probably 2012 maybe was the last time that I can think of anyhow. Although somebody mentioned if 2013 wasn't any better, but I don't remember 2013. But he's still scarred from 2012. So look, I mean, yeah, look, we definitely, I think we need to be smart about our use of slurry. We need to also make sure that we're not putting all our slurry out in our red clover silage and, you know, depleting what we have at home. I mean, I think fertilizer and nutrient management plans are going to be really important, and we really need to consider, you know, the offtakes we're taking out of fields and the returns we have and what our allowances are going to be on farm as well, because it is becoming more challenging. There's no doubt about it. And, you know, there's no point in having, you know, your out farm at, you know, index 3 if the home farm is coming down to a low 2 or a 1, you know. So it's getting more challenging from farmers' perspective. It's probably getting more challenging from your own perspective as advisors as well, to try and make sure that farmers have the allowance that they need to maintain their soil fertility indices.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing that is kind of struck me there as you were talking a minute ago as well is that, like, you said about maybe different swards for different parts of the farm. That's very true with the red clover, isn't it? In that, like, you have to target it at those drier fields. There's no point in putting it into an inch down by the river that it's going to get flooded, like. And is that a good thing in a way, maybe, that, like, you don't probably want the whole of your silage block in red clover either necessarily, like. In terms of, I suppose, doing it in block and the risk of disease maybe to the red clover, which isn't a big issue maybe because of the persistence of it anyway. It'll probably be after a lag phase before it gets replaced again. But, like, yeah, you don't really necessarily want the entire outblock basically to be red clover.
No, absolutely not. And I think we just need to be, you know, red clover, it's a high protein, high quality feed, I suppose. Younger stock do very, very well on it. Too good a feed for dry cows. So no, you still need a certain proportion of, you know, your standard grass silage for that dry cow period over the winter. Otherwise, you'll have too much condition on cows. You know, at prior to calf down. So look, I mean, I would say, and because of the grant that the department have there, I've had a couple of calls from farmers looking to put down huge, you know, their full allowance of red clover, and you're questioning why and how much of this is going to be their silage block, and they're doing it all. That's the wrong thing to do. Probably no more than 25% of our ground we need in red clover silage. And as you mentioned there, we do have disease risks with red clover. We haven't seen any of them. I've never seen them physically, but with the amount of red clover we've started to use here over the last couple of years, we do expect that this to become an issue. So they're soil-borne diseases, and we would always advise a 5-year break between sowns of red clover. But saying that, so red clover we expect to last 3 to 4 years out on farm. 3 years is probably really where we pitch it at. And after that, your red clover proportion is going to be declining. So you're going to have to start going in with more fertilizer, nitrogen, I suppose, to make sure you maintain your silage yields. If you know, at the end of 3 or 4 years, we don't want to be in a situation where we're seeding that ground. You know, we then have to let that go back to a standard grass and white clover sward, or grass only sward. Feed it fertilizer, nitrogen, and continue to maintain that as your silage ground for your dry cow feed, I suppose. So yes, as you say, you're going to have a rotation on the farm where, you know, no more than 25% of your ground is down to red clover at any one time. That's probably going to be where, you know, it needs to be for a lot of farmers. And, you know, again, rotate it around so you don't get that build-up of soil-borne diseases.
Okay, so effectively you're talking about that's your quality silage block.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's going to be either for you know, your younger stock that you're still growing and they need high protein over the winter, or, you know, your lactating cows to supplement at the shoulders of the season, or if we hit a drought, you know, in the mid-season period, again, it's just good quality feed to have for your cows.
Okay, and then just the last question I'll put you is in relation to the red clover. We haven't a huge amount of work done in Irish terms. We're following the British situation, we'll say, predominantly for recommended varieties and so forth there. Is that a concern, or are we kind of equally, because of longitude and latitude and so forth, is it fine to use the British stuff, even though they don't maybe operate the same type of farming system like?
Sure, look, Stuart, I think, the biggest issue at the moment is even the lack of availability of varieties that are on the UK recommended list. Because there's been a huge increase in demand for red clover, and that has been, right throughout Europe. Even they historically would have been using a lot more than us. Anyhow, but like there's massive demand there for red clover, and it's very, very difficult to get anything on the UK recommended list. We do have some abertars which we're putting in our mixtures, but we're mixing it with another non-UK recommended list red clover because we don't have sufficient abertar to meet the demand. Because the red clover demand has increased by about 1,200% here over the last 3 years. So you can't just magic up that seed from nowhere. It isn't. I suppose if we all had crystal balls, things would be a lot easier. But look, the department, to be fair to the Department of Agriculture, they are starting to evaluate red clovers. They're sowing down a red clover trial for the first time this year, which I think is, would have been nice if it had happened earlier, but it is happening now. So it's good to see that being sown down now. Take a number of years for the varieties to go through that evaluation process. Realistically, you're probably talking, where are we now, 2024, and they'll start the varieties sown down this year will be measured for the first time in 2025. So you're probably talking nearly 2030 before we have an Irish recommended list for red clovers. But we tend to see the varieties which do well in the UK are also varieties which are doing well here. So I wouldn't be overly concerned by having to look towards the UK recommended list. The challenge is even getting varieties, as I say, that are on that UK recommended list, because the demand has increased so substantially over such a short period of time. It's very hard to get those varieties.
Okay, so Mary, we've clocked up our half an hour there quite quickly. A very interesting conversation with you, so thanks very much for coming on and joining me and giving me a very broad overview of the whole seed industry. Obviously, it's quite challenging to try and preempt what people are going to require, so I don't envy you your job. So thanks very much for coming on to us today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Age podcast, and my thanks to Mary McEvoy for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join us next time for your Dairy Age.